This particular story in 1 Samuel is one of those great mountaintop Bible stories. Now, we're going to get to chapter 17 in a little bit. We're going to start in chapter 8 and talk about some context. So I hope you like a great story. Since most people have read this passage, they know the history of this time in 1 Samuel. It's been told from preachers and evangelists and Sunday school teachers and parents who want to interact with their children about David and Goliath. I want you to know I don't expect to reveal any new and grand mysteries to you this morning, okay? My intent is to reinvigorate your thinking on purpose, your purpose in life, on preparation for the battle, recognition of opportunities, and God's power at your disposal. So open up your imagination to a time of kings and giants and ancient warfare and the miracle of a nation redeemed by God through a young lad. So we'll start with kind of a context to this story in 1 Samuel chapter 8, introducing Saul. Now, it's about 3,000 years ago, and the people of Israel are clamoring for a king. Now, Samuel was God's prophet who judged Israel, but that wasn't good enough according to the people of Israel. So we see in chapter 8, verse 5 through 7. Let's start with verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways, nor make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Notice that. Now make us a king to judge us like all other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So this is the problem that we're seeing here as we look forward towards 1 Samuel chapter 17. The context of the story is that Samuel has been directed by God to judge Israel. And they've decided they don't want to be judged by Samuel. They want to have a king like everybody else. Now we see that Saul is introduced in chapter 9 and verse 2. Chapter 9, by the way, we're going to glean over a lot of pages. So this would be great for you to go back and read these chapters from chapter 8 through 17. We don't have time to read all these verses. In chapter 9 and verse 2, And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. So we see that Saul is introduced. Now, there's a lot of different verses that kind of reveal a little bit about Saul's character. And we find that this early time in Saul's life, he seemed to be humble and listening to God. But he was also a big fella. He was tall. He was taller than everybody else. And maybe that's the reason why they chose him at this particular time. But here he is. We find Saul is introduced. And then we find in chapter 10, verse 1, some story is told. Samuel has some discourse with Saul. In chapter 10, verse 1, Then Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head and kissed him and said, Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? So Samuel, God's prophet, goes ahead and he anoints Saul king of Israel. So in God's eyes, he's going to be the king. And then we go to chapter 10, verse 23 to 24. And they ran and fetched him thence. And when by the way, where was he? He was going to be crowned the king of Israel. And they ran and fetched him. Where was Saul? Well, go back to verse 21. When they had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Matri was taken, and Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. And when they sought him, he could not be found. Therefore, they inquired of the Lord further if a man should yet come thither. And the Lord answered, Behold, he hath hid himself among the stuff. We see a little kind of a look into maybe Saul's character here. He's scared to death. And he's going to be anointed the king, and he's hid himself. So we go on in verse 23. And they ran and fetched him thence. And when he stood among the people, he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. And I think that probably impressed the people. They shouldn't have thought, why was he hiding? Where was he? Why is it taking so long? No, he was hiding. So he was standing there, head and shoulders above everybody. Verse 24. And Samuel said to all the people, See ye him who the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. And so Samuel anointed Saul, and Saul is here enthroned. Now we go to chapter 13. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. This is 2 years into Saul's reign. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, and whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. Verse 3. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah. And the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Pharisees, the Philistines, and that Israel also was had in abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. So we see this is 2 years later after Saul's been enthroned as king, and his army attacks a Philistine garrison and wins a great victory, and Saul brags about the victory. And this is one thing that Saul would do. So he bragged about the victory. But you know, the Philistines, they were a mighty warrior people. And they decided, we're not going to have this. So we have verse 5. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. Listen how many people they gathered. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is in the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward from Beth Aven. So the Philistines heard of this garrison getting raided, and they raised this large army. And they're going to go do battle with Saul and the children of Israel. So look at verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Now, why had Saul done foolishly? Well, as the Philistines gathered this army, this huge army, something that the Hebrews did not have, and they were afraid. So people were really scared. People left the country. Part of his army left the country. And they kind of got together with Saul in Gilgal, and they asked Samuel to come and sacrifice and ask God to give them a blessing. So that was the deal. Samuel was going to come to Gilgal, and Saul and the people were supposed to wait 7 days. And then he was going to come and he was going to seek God's guidance. Well, Saul got a little impatient. And Saul decided, you know what? Samuel hasn't gotten here yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do the burnt offering. Now, that wasn't his job. It wasn't his calling. It was only the prophet and the priest's job to do. And look what it says in verse 9. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, well, you know what happened? Samuel came. We get impatient. We decide we're going to do things. We're going to do it the way we want to do it. And Samuel's not here, so I'm going to go ahead and do the burnt offering. And then as soon as he does the burnt offering, guess who shows up? God's prophet, Samuel. Samuel came and Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him. Because, Saul's all full of himself now. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to meet Samuel and everything's going to be great. And Samuel in verse 11, Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. It wasn't his job. He wanted to use his arm of the flesh to see if God would bless him and do the burnt offering. And that's why in verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, if you'd done right. Verse 14, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. So we see this serious situation that has developed. Now, God hasn't taken him from being king yet. But what Samuel did was Samuel judged him and showed him that he had done what was wrong. So now we go on to chapter 15. And in chapter 15, verses 21 through 23. Chapter 15, verse 21. But the people took of the spoil sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. So here's the story. The setting is, now God is sending Saul on a mission to defeat Agag and the Amalekites for past sins that the Amalekites had committed. Yet Saul again disobeys God's command, because God told him that they should destroy all the Amalekites and kill Agag and destroy their sheep and their oxen and everything they had. Destroy them utterly. But what happens? They decide, I think we'll keep Agag. Maybe we can use him later on. I think we'll keep the best of the sheep and the best of the cattle. Because, we can use those. Verse 22. And Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? See, God wants us to obey his voice, not to think outside the box. Oh, we can have a good alliance with Agag now. Oh, we've got to get the best of the sheep, That's not what God told him to do. As we continue on, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Now, listen to this verse, verse 23. This is a great verse. If you got teenagers, you want to memorize this verse. For rebellion is as the sin as witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. So these two examples as context in the story show that Saul has been rejected as king of Israel. And Samuel is sad about this. Samuel hates this. He has prayed for Saul. He has worked with Saul. Samuel is so sad, but he does what God commands him to do. And we see Samuel judges Saul in chapter 15 and verse 26. Look at verse 26. And Samuel said unto Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. And from this time forward, Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. So that's a sad context of the story. Saul started out good, but Saul got full of himself, and now God has rejected him. So let's look at David. In chapter 16, verses 5 through 13. Chapter 16, verses 5 through 13. And what we see here is Samuel has gone to David's father, Jesse of Bethlehem. And it says in verse 5, and he said peaceably, I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. So the point is, Samuel has come here to find God's chosen king and to anoint God's chosen king, the new king. Now, by the way, there's a lot of story that happens between this point and the time David is actually anointed king. There's quite a bit of story that goes on, well past chapter 17. But we see here that God is showing to Samuel there's going to be a new king that will rule after my own heart, not after his own heart. So we see verse 7. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature. Now, isn't that what the people did with Saul? Because I have refused him. For the Lord seeketh not as man seeketh. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. So that's what God's going to do. He's going to look on the heart of the new prospective king of Israel. Now, he's speaking about Eliab. He's the oldest of the 8 brothers. He says in verse 6 that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Even Samuel is thinking, well, surely this is the guy. He's kind of like Saul. He's head and shoulders above. He's the oldest of Jesse's sons. God says no. He says, I look on different things. I don't look on the outward appearance and the height and the good looking and the hair and the teeth and everything, you know. He says, I look on the inner part of the man. Then verse 8, then Jesse called Abinadab, this is the second, and made him pass before, and he was rejected. And verse 9, then Jesse made Shema to pass by. This is the third oldest. And he said, neither hath the Lord chosen this. So they go through all of them, and Samuel says, aren't there any more? You know, he goes through 7 of them, and he says, aren't there any more? And Jesse says, well, the youngest, he's out tending the sheep. And he says, well, call him. So he comes in, verse 12, and he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look on. And the Lord said, arise to Samuel, anoint him, for this is he. Now I think his brothers were probably wondering what was going on. The snotty-nosed, rugrat, the teenager, the 15, 16-year-old boy, the shepherd boy, he has been chosen. So we see this youngest son of Jesse. He's a shepherd boy. He's a musician. He's a goodly-looking youth with red hair. That's what ruddy means. He just had red hair, and he had a fair complexion. He had, in some Hebrew texts say that he had beautiful eyes. And so David is anointed by Samuel to be eventually down the road. But in God's eyes, He's anointed David as the king, the chosen king of Israel. And life goes on. But now we get to the title of our message. Giants in the land. And that's what we want to talk about in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we're going to see a battlefield is set. And we're introduced to the Philistines and Goliath. Now, the Philistine army comes to the valley of Elah. It's about 20 miles inland from the Mediterranean and about 20 miles west of Jerusalem. So basically, Jerusalem, the Mediterranean, and it's basically right in the middle. It's a natural battlefield with mountains on either side of an east-west running valley with a brook running down the middle. Now, the two armies set their bulwarks and barricades and tents on each side of the valley. Most likely, Saul's army on the north of the valley and the Philistines on the south, because the Philistines came from the south and Saul and his people were north of Jerusalem where they were encamped. So we see something about Goliath's appearance. Look at chapter 17, verses 4 through 7. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like the weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So we see a little something about Goliath. Now, Goliath was an experienced, fierce warrior. He served the Philistine gods of Dagon, Baal, and Ashtarte. These were gods of war and reproduction, both for crops and also for pagan sexuality. They were lewd, base, pagan, Phoenician deities. And so we see a little something about Goliath. Now, it describes Goliath, right? How tall was Goliath? About 9 feet. I have terrible airing, but I think you said it 9 feet. Now, there's commentaries will always have a little bit of leeway on these weights and stuff. They'll have gauges. But basically, Goliath was like 9.5 to 10 feet tall. He was a huge dude, and he was a warrior. His coat of mail, that's what the Romans used and what many ancient peoples used. It was basically a coat with pieces of metal sewn to it, so that it would help to keep arrows or spears from going through it. Okay, so his coat of mail that he wore was probably 140 pounds. Now that's kind of like what modern warriors, Marines, when they carry their backpacks. Sometimes they'll carry up to 200 pounds, but that's really unusual. Usually 100 to maybe 150 pounds, especially if they're going to be bivouacking out in the wilderness somewhere. He used a javelin whose head alone, just the head alone, weighed 17 pounds. Imagine that spearhead coming towards you. And the shield, he didn't even carry the shield. The shield was carried by a warrior bearing his pagan crest. So there's something that Goliath does here. Remember, there are always giants in the land, and we have to combat them. But Goliath is one that's really exceptional. A 10-foot tall giant, and he's going to offer a challenge. Look at what he says in verses 8 through 11. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine? He's saying, I'm a warrior. What are you doing coming out to me? And you, servants of Saul. Now, don't you just get the idea that he's kind of cutting Saul down a little bit here? You know, I'm a Philistine. I'm a warrior. And you guys you're servants of Saul. Choose you a man for you and let him come down to me. So that's the challenge. Choose a man, come do battle with me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So notice the disdain. He says, I'm a Philistine. I'm a great warrior. Notice his opinion of Saul. He doesn't think much of Saul. He defies the armies of Israel. And the challenge is simple, according to his statement. He says, just choose you out a man and fight me. The champions will battle, and whosoever wins, the loser serves the winner. And verse 16 gives you an idea of how they feel about this challenge. They all shake in their boots, verse 11. Verse 16, and the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. So, do you see what's going on here? The Philistine comes, Goliath, the giant. And he comes out down the valley of Elah. Now, if you ever see pictures of the valley of Elah, or if you've ever been there, you recognize that this is a natural battlefield. Mountain on one side, mountain on the other, or hill. And the armies could set themselves up, their battlements, their encasements, their trenches. They could set themselves up on either side. And then Goliath would come down. He'd walk down onto the valley floor and he would shout out to the army of Israel his challenge. And by the way, you can hear real clearly if somebody's talking down on the valley. And this is a giant man. I think his vocal cords were pretty good. And he could tell everybody on that hill what he was thinking. And they heard every man what he was saying. So I got a time out. Here's the story. Maybe we could say, let's have a parenthetical pause. 40 days, morning and night. For 40 days, Goliath comes down, stands on the valley floor, and challenges the armies of Israel, the armies of God. Silence. He doesn't hear anything. Now, there's not technically complete silence because the armies would come out and they would shout at each other and bang on their shields and they would do all that sort of stuff, Braveheart kind of stuff. And then they'd go back to their camps. No battle because there's a challenge. The challenge is, give me a man. Now, I kind of have to question, why does this go on for 40 days? And I have some answers for that. Number one, you see the giant, he wanted to generate fear. And giants love to do that. Giants want to generate fear. Look at verse 11 in chapter 17. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. This is what giants do. They cause fear in those who aren't following what God says. Look at verse 24. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. Look at verse 32. And David said to Saul, now we'll get to this part, but we need to look at this. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. What does he say? David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. So you see, the giant, he generated fear. There's a second thing. The giant generated rebuke. And this rebuke was amongst friends and countrymen. This should never happen in the church. But this does happen. And we have to be careful of this kind of thing happening. Look at verse 28. Now, here's what's happened. David has come to the battlefield. We'll get back and talk about David a little bit. But David's come to the battlefield. And he sees what's going on. And he sees everybody running to their tent. His brothers, Eliab, Shammah, and Abinadab. And they're afraid. They're scared. And he doesn't see Saul anywhere. Saul's in the back of the formation in his tent. Right? And so David sees this and he issues a challenge. He says, what's going to be done to the guy who goes and kills Goliath? Okay, rebuke, verse 28. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left, what does he say? Those few sheep in the wilderness. Do you see the rebuke that he gives to David? You're just a lad. You're just a shepherd boy. What did you do with those few sheep? Well, hello, this is Eliab's father's sheep. He's got more than just a few sheep. But you see, he's sending rebuke to David. He says, you left those few sheep in the wilderness. I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. You just want to come see the battle. What did you do with your few sheep? You see, we have to recognize the giant is going to generate rebuke, even amongst family, friends, and countrymen. Now, the giant also generates complacency. Look at verse 25. Complacency. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. So why aren't you claiming these things? These guys are saying to David, well, this is what will happen if Goliath is destroyed by a man. Look at verse 33. And Saul said to David, now, they've told Saul what David has been saying. All right? And they send David to Saul. And we get this response in verse 33. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine. Well, you are. I mean, don't you have like a shield and all the stuff that goes with a warrior's dress? You've got all the metal, and you've got a spear, and you've got a sword, and you've probably got somebody that even takes some of this stuff with. Can't you, Saul, go take care of Goliath? Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. Complacency. Now look at verse 38 and 39. And Saul armed David with his armor. They have this discussion, and okay, I'll give you my armor. And he put an helmet of brass upon his head. He armed him with a coat of mail, and David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. So I want you to understand something here, how Saul down to every warrior that there was, they felt there was no hope. Why? Because the giant was out shooting his mouth off. Now, he was a giant, without a doubt, but you know what they say? The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Well, we haven't gotten to that yet. Okay, so who's going to defeat this 10-foot giant? And then we see verses 38 and 39. David's going to be sent by Saul, and Saul's going to put ordinary means on David to overcome an extraordinary task. You see this here? Saul wants to give David his armor. Ordinary means, arm of the flesh. This is not how David has fought. This is not David's style. You see, the arm of the flesh is presented instead of God's power. When the giant comes into the valley and is shooting his mouth off, don't take the arm of the flesh to go out and defeat him. That would have been the worst thing for David. So David, he puts off this armor. He recognizes, this is not me. This is not what God did for me and through me. So the answer to Goliath's challenge is God sending God's chosen to defeat the enemy. That's the answer. There's no room for fear. There's no room for rebuke. There's no complacency or dependence on the arm of the flesh. Just one man and one smooth stone. Okay, now we can get back into our third point because we're going to talk about one very short fight. And I hope you recognize that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a fight, but it's going to be really short. First of all, look at David. I want you to see something about David. Verse 20. And David rose up early in the morning, and he left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench, the barricades, the trenches, the places where the army was at. As the host was going forth to the fight, shouted for the battle. So we see something about David. He rises early and he wants to go see the battle. Verse 22. Look at what it says. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brother. So we see something else about David. He runs to the battle. And then verse 26. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? David sees honor in fighting for God. And then verse 29. And David said, now listen to this. This is probably one of those passages that every Christian should memorize and know about. After the rebuke, David stands there in front of the army of God, in front of his oldest brother Eliab, a man and a warrior. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? You see, David had a vision. He had vision of what was right and how to accomplish it. Look at verse 32. And the second part of verse 32, when he talks with Saul, he says, Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. So David had absolute courage. David's not a proven warrior. Oh, well, wait a minute. He actually is. So first we look at David, and then we secondly look at his experience. Look at verses 34 to 37. David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by the beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. And then he says, verse 37. We'll get to that in just a second. What's the main emphasis of David's argument? Verse 37. David said, moreover, the Lord. Now, this is what most people forget when they get into a battle with a giant. And David said, moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. And of course, Saul stayed in his tent. And David went out. So, third, David knew what empowered him. David knew what empowered him. Look at verses 38 through 40. And Saul armed David with his armor. We've read that part. We know that he puts his armor on him, his shield and sword and all that sort of stuff. David says, you know, he's like 15, 16 years old, and Saul's like the biggest guy in the kingdom. And so he's like rattling around in this armor, you know. I can't, this is not me. So he puts it off, he throws it down, and he says, verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, with his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So we see David knew what empowered him. He knew that he was a shepherd, and he used his shepherd's tools because God had used those before in the past. Fourth, David is focused. Look at verses 41 through 48. Now, this is telling about what's going to happen in the battle. Verse 41 through 48. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Remember, we described a little bit about David. So he looks on him, and he sees this pretty young 16-year-old boy. Verse 43, and the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. You see, he served Baal and Astarte and these different Philistine gods, these gods of the Philistines. And he is cursing at David. He is trying to put fear in David. Does it work? Verse 44. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a hand. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. And I will, by the way, why would he take his head from him? Well, think about it. 16-year-old boy, 10-year-old giant. Would anybody believe that he defeated him? So taking the head of an enemy was showing absolute power over that individual or that army. So David knew he would need to take the head of Goliath in order to show everybody that he had done what God said he would do. Verse 47, and all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to David, to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And then we see a very, very short battle. But I want you to understand, David was focused. He was focused on what God told him, how to do it, and with the armaments that he was experienced and accustomed with to use. He used his proven experience and his knowledge of God that he learned while shepherding his father's flock. Fifth, David is victorious. Look at, look at verse 49. Excuse me. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone. I want you to get a really good picture of this. Here's David. He's run to the Philistine. He's ready to win the battle right now. And he gets in his bag and he pulls out a stone. Now, I've got 5 stones in my hand. Remember when he was by the river, he pulled out 5 stones? Do you think he was thinking he was going to miss? No. We know Goliath had some brothers. And so David was thinking, I'm going to have to kill 4 more giants this morning. Okay. So he takes the stones, and the Hebrew word that's used here for sunk. So he takes the stone out, puts it in a sling, and as he's running towards the giant, he slings the stone at the giant. And the Bible says that the stone sunk in his forehead, and he fell down dead. I want to get the picture of this, because commentaries sometimes they play games with words. And sometimes I've actually read in a couple commentaries that the stone bounced off his head and he was, Goliath was, he was like, oh boy, what was that? And then Goliath went and cut his head off. No, that's not what happened. The Hebrew word and the grammatical way that all the words are set up in the verse 49, tells us that the stone sunk in Goliath's forehead. Did you get that? That stone sunk. The word is tabah in Greek. And what it does, it gives you the idea as if you are standing over a pond and you drop a rock into the water and it goes right to the bottom. Let me tell you, when David flung that stone and God pushed it with his omnipotent finger, it went through Goliath's forehead and all the way to the back of his head. Maybe out the back of his head. I don't know. But I'll tell you this. David says, and God says in verse 49, David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it. And what did he do? He smote. That means he killed the Philistine. Smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk, tabah, went all the way through his head, in his forehead, and he fell down. Now look at this beautiful grammatical wording here. And he fell upon his face to the earth. He didn't stumble back and, moan or cry. Some commentaries again say that he was stunned, but God doesn't conquer in that manner. God doesn't conquer in that manner. See, God used his man, his method, his power, and one smooth, round stone. Sixth, victory is completed. David then uses Goliath's sword, and he takes proof of victory over the giant. Next, here's what happens next, right? Okay, so David is standing there in the valley. Goliath, that big guy, he's fallen face to the ground in the earth. And David takes Goliath's sword and proof of victory. And as he holds it up, what happens? Eliab and Abinadab and Shammah And I don't know where Saul's doing, but the rest of the army goes, charge! And they run down that valley and they go and they kill all the Philistines. They run like 7 miles killing Philistines. And then they get to the end, they go to a particular town. They stop their slaying and they're victorious and they come back to the camp victorious. Application. What can we learn from this history? What can we learn from this story? There will always be giants in the land. Always. They want to put fear in our hearts. They want to discourage us. They want to confuse us. They want to rebuke us with the biggest lies and the most vile language. They will drive us to complacency and inaction. They will attempt to drive hope from our hearts. They will encourage us to resort to the arm of the flesh because I have no hope, so I gotta arm my flesh. But God always gives us deliverance against the giants. If we are prepared. David was prepared. If we are focused. David was focused. If we know and depend upon God's power and His means, not our means. If we run to the battle and stand in God's strength and expect the giant to fall, God will give us that blessing like He did here in 1 Samuel chapter 17.